The second season of Paramount's Halo television series is finally here. We spoke about the trailers a little while ago, and across the board they seemed pretty good. But does the show itself carry the same excitement and momentum? Well, that's the question that we're going to be answering today. So anyways, without wasting any more of your time, let's jump straight in. They've started things off by releasing the first 2 episodes, and I'm going to try and keep this review mostly spoiler free. However, there is of course going to be elements that I will talk about that might spoil elements of the show, so if you do intend on watching it, this is your warning to click away now. Also, fair warning, I won't really be using footage from the show as I don't want this video to get taken down by Paramount. So unfortunately, gameplay from Infinite and the odd screenshot here and there are gonna have to do. Anyways, the first episode, Sanctuary, starts off extremely strong. This segment itself had me on the edge of my seat the entire time. The action and the way the characters act was spot on, and they make the Covenant feel terrifying, which is something that I was really hoping for. We have some little elements of actual Halo music sprinkled in there, and across the board the sound design seems solid. The soundtrack this season is composed by the amazing Bear McCreary. And if that sounds familiar, he's worked on games such as God of War Ragnarok, but the real highlight for me is his work in Godzilla King of the Monsters, as the soundtrack for that film is absolutely phenomenal. And from the first episode alone, I think he's done a pretty good job here too. Anyways, getting back to the episode itself, I do want to say that I really love the way that Silver Team interact with one another. They feel much more human this time around, which is great since we all know Spartans aren't robots. They don't act robotic 100% of the time. And seeing them to be written in the way that they are and have much more engaging relationships with one another is something that was very nice to see. After the extremely explosive introduction, we're reintroduced to Keyes. He doesn't really do too much in this first episode, but he seems to act much more in line with his in-game counterpart. And then we're introduced to James Ackerson. If that name sounds familiar, that is because he has appeared in Halo media before. He essentially functions as a rival to Catherine Halsey, and eventually leads to the creation of the Spartan 3s. Personally, I found him to be a pretty enjoyable character here, and in a way he kind of rivals John. I like the conflict that started to develop with these two characters, and I'm excited to see how it will develop even more later on in the season. Unfortunately, after this, I do think the episode takes a bit of a dive as it goes over to the side plot with Soren. And I don't really have anything against Soren as a character. Unfortunately, this little side story right now does not captivate my interest whatsoever. I have a pretty strong feeling that the stuff that happens here will end up linking to the main story in some capacity. And if that does end up being the case, I think that will more than make up for the boredom that I felt while these scenes were taking place. We do meet some other Spartans in this first episode, being Team Cobalt, and I really like the banter and arguments that they have with Silver Team. But yet you still get this sense that they still care for one another in some capacity, especially with Chief, as he seems very concerned about the mission that they're being sent on. Throughout most of this first episode, pretty much all of the UNSC related stuff I thought was done really well. I like that despite the UNSC and Oni technically being the good guys, it shows that they aren't perfect. And I think that side of things overall was handled really well. There is some random stuff that happens with Chief's character a bit later on in the episode, which I wasn't a fan of, and it felt really out of place, and a lot of it links to his relationship with Cortana, who isn't really present at all in this first episode. I'm somewhat intrigued in what direction they will take this later on, but as of right now it's not something that I really care for. As a whole, I would say the first episode was solid. I think it has an extremely strong start and does take a bit of a nosedive from there, but it does have some really good moments sprinkled in throughout. And I would still say this first episode is better than the entirety of the first season. Now moving on to episode 2, across the board I don't think it was quite as exciting as episode 1, but that doesn't necessarily mean I think it was worse. I think it did a great job at expanding upon some of the relationships and dynamics, like I'd already mentioned in the first episode. There's more tension that builds between John and Ackerson, which I think is a very interesting plot development. I really enjoyed the little side plot with Riz, and it's really nice to just see more of Silver Team interacting with one another. Right now, I really love Vanek as a character. I think he's great. I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about Chief as a whole. I think he is much better this time around than he was in the first season. As Master Chief's #1 fan, I really hate how they handled his character in the first season. But for these episodes, he is handled much better. That being said, I still think there's moments where he definitely does act a bit out of character, but all things considered, he seems much more like the Master Chief. I still hate how they seem to act like John and Master Chief are two separate entities, as if they're not the same person. I kinda get what they're going for, but at the same time I don't really think it's that necessary. I actually think episode 2 does an amazing job at showing the strength and speed of Spartans too. There's this moment where they're running an exercise drill, and you see how agile they are and that they can definitely take a hit. And again, this is something that I really appreciate because I feel like we don't get to see this enough in the games. Because almost everything is experienced through a first-person point of view, you don't really actually realise how strong the characters you are playing as are, and I'm glad the show gives us a good visual representation of that. Again, just like the first episode, the highlights are mostly the stuff with the UNSC, with the Spartans, with Oni. There isn't really much of a Covenant presence here until the very end of the episode, and again, this moment is amazing. But this episode does dedicate quite a bit of screen time to Kwan Ha, who played quite a big role in the first season, and I'm assuming that will be the case here too. I didn't mention her with episode 1 because she didn't show up until right at the very end, but in this second episode she does have a bit of a bigger role, which I'm assuming will directly tie into Soren's story. But again, as of right now, I really have no interest in any of this. There was a third little side story going on, revolving around Catherine Halsey, and this adds a nice bit of mystery to the show that I kind of appreciate. There wasn't a ton done with her here, and I, again, can't really go into much detail without spoiling it, but I did find these parts quite intriguing. I don't think episode 2 reached the same highs as the first episode, but I think it felt much more consistent throughout. In summary, so far, I think I'm kind of enjoying the series. Again, I say this as someone who resented the first one, but I've gone in this with an open mind, and despite it having some very obvious flaws, I think it is a massive improvement, and feels much more like what we should have had in the first place. Everything from the writing, the cinematography, the way that the characters are characterized, the sound design, feels much better. It looks and sounds like Halo. Of course, like I've said, there is parts where it definitely dips, and I'm not exactly loving it, but every single time the intro plays, man, it's enough to make a grown man cry. Based on the first 2 episodes, I'm going to currently give the show a 7 out of 10. Hopefully that ranking improves as it goes on. I will try my best to review every single episode individually as they come out, if that's something that everyone wants to see. I definitely think it's worth giving a shot though, even if you didn't really enjoy the first season. Anyway, I am curious to hear what everyone else has to say if you have watched it. Like I said, I haven't gone fully into detail to try and keep things mostly spoiler free, but I will do like a full spoiler review by the time the season ends, so I suppose keep an eye out for that. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.